I'm Josh Rosen, illustrator of History Comics World War II, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. On this episode, I chat with Josh Rosen about his new graphic novel, History Comics World War II, Fight on the Home Front. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. If you want to help the site and the podcast, please consider supporting the effort by chipping in at ko-fi.com/True North Country Comics. Your patronage, as always, is greatly appreciated. Josh Rosen is a Toronto-based cartoonist and illustrator. A graduate of the Centre for Cartoon Studies, Josh has done illustration work for magazines, animation projects, tabletop role-playing games, as well as a slew of small press comics work. His first graphic novel, The Good Fight with author Ted Staunton, was longlisted for the Toronto Book Awards. His second graphic novel, History Comics World War II, with author Kate Hannigan, is now available. History Comics World War II Fight on the Home Front tells a story about how millions of Americans joined the fight by working assembly lines, growing vegetables, and collecting scrap metal during World War II. When we think of war, we often focus on the battlefields, but during the war years of 1941 to 1945, Americans at home did whatever they could to support the troops and defeat the Nazis. While millions of soldiers ship out to fight on battlefronts in Europe and the Pacific, millions of men, women, and children step into new and exciting roles in cities and towns all across the United States. 4 curious kids take us into factories, farms, and even kitchens to show what the fight on the home front looks like up close. So, without further ado, here's my chat with Josh Rosen about his new graphic novel, History Comics World War II, Fight on the Home Front. So, Josh Rosen, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I appreciate your time. I know we just chatted recently at the Artsy Fartsy Comic Con,
Yes.
but wanted to have a much broader conversation about your latest project. But before we get to all the questions, I want to ask you, what's on your bedside reading table? What are you reading today?
Well, today, my bedside table, to be honest, is very dominated by research material right now for my next book project, which I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about or not. It's a lot of reference books right now.
Ah, okay. Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, we can speculate as what that might be, but we won't pry, that's for sure. Let's get talking about your latest project, your newest book, History Comics World War II. I wonder if you could describe that book to me and to listeners. How would you describe it?
Yeah, so the book is a kid-oriented look at the Second World War and what it was like for people living through it that were not necessarily on the front lines of the war front, but for the people living at home when all their friends, relatives, a lot of people they knew were fighting overseas, and how society had to change in order to meet this huge global event that was going on. So it goes from day-to-day stuff like, the fact that some foods were being rationed, weren't available, to what did people do for fun? What sort of jobs did people who, the shift in terms of women in the workplace, the shift in terms of kids having to suddenly take on adult jobs, and what it was like seeing the whole society change as a result of the Second World War.
Yeah, it was definitely educational for me. I mean, I didn't live through that. I remember certain things being told to me, but the book is written from the viewpoint of 4 kids who sort of, they're educating you as you're reading and as you're learning and looking. And it goes beyond what most kids of that time period could comprehend. So things that we learned afterwards, both altogether tragic and that sort of thing.
Yeah, although we return quite regularly to the kid perspective, we want to be thorough about, everything that was happening in the period and give readers a pretty comprehensive look at what was going on a broader scale.
Yeah, it's definitely comprehensive, that's for sure. You pack a lot in those panels. We'll get to that a bit later. But I want to ask you about your connection. How did you connect with author Kate Hannigan for this book?
This project came about right on the heels of my previous graphic novel collaboration, which was the book The Good Fight that I did with author Ted Staunton. That was about, that was Canadian history, about 1930s Toronto, about that period right before the Second World War. And due to the success of that book, I was approached about doing this sort of follow-up, with a different publisher, about this other book about a similar time period. And in some ways, I kind of think of it as this is almost like, not a sequel in the literal sense, but a sequel in terms of, okay, well, if what a reader of The Good Fight wanted to know, so what happened in the world after that point, this is the book that sort of follows from that. So it felt like a very natural progression for me to go over that. In fact, when the opportunity came up, I kind of looked over at my bookshelf full of reference material from the time period and said, you know what, I don't have to necessarily start trimming some of these books yet. I can keep them on hand and, continue in that direction.
Yeah, it's always handy to repurpose, reuse books and reference material, that's for sure. Now, this book literally has history illustrated in every panel. It's not just quick brushstrokes where the background is like, oh, it's interpretive. No, it's actual details. And you pack so many details that are very authentic. How did you approach this project? Did you have to educate yourself about you mentioned how you worked on The Good Fight, but did you educate yourself a little bit more about the visual look of that time period?
Oh, yes, 100%. That you've identified what was, without question, the biggest challenge of this project was the fact that, well, like we said, it covers sort of a broad range of what was going on within this period. And also it jumps around quite a lot from, page to page and panel to panel in terms of what is being covered. There's so much information that we tried to fit inside of this book. And, I'm constantly looking at reference for all of it, down to, if kids are playing with playing cards in a particular panel, I want to make sure I get those playing cards right. Interiors of houses, clothes, things like that. I had to dive pretty deep. I had the advantage, like I said, that I had just done a book about the sort of pre-war period, so I had a little bit of reference for that. Obviously, this takes place about a decade after Good Fight did, so there were still some changes in terms of, things like clothing that was in style, even things like the sort of cars that were around. But also, I had the benefit of, World War II is a period in history that is very thoroughly documented. So I had a lot of access to reference photos and things like that are available online and, through research in libraries, what I was able to do. And also, it was a period in which there was quite a lot of iconography that's already associated with it. There was a ton of propaganda and posters and things like that were being produced, and those do a ton for defining what the era really looked like. And I had that, pretty easily available to look at, to get a feel of like, okay, I can find a poster of women working in factories, say. I can find a poster of the military uniforms of the time. I could find posters of, they would be depicting kids getting together, encouraging them to do scrap gathering and things like that. And that would be an easy reference for the panels where I had to depict that.
Right. Yeah. It's a lot of research. That's for sure. No.
Yes, that's for sure. But thankfully there was a lot of resources available for this. And I'd do my best to compile it in the book. So we hopefully don't have to research quite as much as I did.
Well, I tell you, it's like a history lesson. I felt like I was cramming for an exam reading this book because it's so much chock-a-block in there. Yeah, one thing I like to point out that really, I appreciate being a comic book fan is that you actually took time to have a page talking about comic books during World War II, and wondering, what was your feeling about that?
Oh, I was very glad to include that. That was actually part of Kate's script originally, and she knew it was a graphic novel, so it was all it was all part of the plan. But even without that, comic books were such a huge part of the culture, honestly, especially for a kid during the period. This was the age of the rise of a lot of these huge heroes that are now household names. They were to a degree then too. Your Captain America, your Wonder Woman, your Superman, all of they were on the rise during the period. There's that famous cover of Captain America punching Hitler from the period. Namor and Human Torch were fighting Nazis during the period too. The war was manifesting in these comic books in the period.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. The fact that you actually put that in really stood out to me as a comic book fan.
I'll add too, as part of the promotion for the book, we have got a a very small Canadian supplement that has some additional Canada exclusive facts that are going to be carried by a few Canadian independent bookstores as part of the first run of the book. And it's got in it, I did it in part almost entirely because I wanted to talk a little bit about the Canadian whites, the fact that
Ooh, wow.
Yeah, right. Well, so for I'll just briefly explain for those who aren't familiar that during the war years, Canada had a lot of restrictions in terms of what could come across the border. Any, non-essential things were outright banned. And one of the things that was not available in Canada during the war years were American comic books. And so there was a small Canadian exclusive comic book superhero comic industry popped up with all these Canada specific superhero, Nirvana of the North or Johnny Canuck and all of this. And they had this rise during the war years and then partially disappeared after. I mean, that's something that there's a lot of other really good resources out there you can read about, but I wanted to call that out. So I've got in this little pamphlet that you can get at currently it'll be available from, if you're in Toronto, from The Beguiling, from Elamino Books. A couple other bookstores are going to be carrying these additional Canadian fact pamphlets that goes along with our book.
That's cool. Now, I want to talk about the collaboration process with Kate. Did she, at the outset, give you a script and just said you're on your way, or was there a back and forth process?
Yes. So in this one, this was a project where I was brought on when the script was already ready. It had already was pretty much final edit. I think there was one more edit that happened after I was brought on. But even then, we did still have a pretty regular back and forth, and I still had a bit of room for interpretation. I mean, I looked at the script, but I find in comics, you don't really know what it's going to look like until you've had a chance to do a run through and thumbnail it out and see sort of what the layouts are. There were instances where there was pieces of information that were supposed to all fit on a page, and it just made sense to squish some of it over onto the next page or to rearrange things a little bit so that certain pages were not as information dense. So I had some freedom to do that. Kate and I had a back and forth about how we would be interpreting that. There are also a couple of instances of moments where we talked about it, where, it just felt like the moment needed a little more space than what was allocated for it in the script. This was a book project where not only was there a script, but there was essentially an assigned page count. This is part of the larger history comic series that First Second puts out, and they like their books to be more or less of a similar length in this series. So we had to make sure that we were fitting it within that page count. Yeah, we had a lot of conversations about, I guess, essentially allocation of resources to say, you know what, I think this moment really needs more space in a single page, and talking about, okay, can we shift this over to the next page, or can we squish some of this information together a little bit more in order to make space for, this other particular moment.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I remember that in Times Square when you had all those people. I can imagine that was a bit of a challenge from illustration.
Oh Lord, yeah. That one. I mean, it's because this is how how World War II went. There was a victory in Europe celebration, and then there was a victory in Japan celebration. These were two separate moments, both of which were in the script, both of which were moments we wanted to depict, but two huge crowd scenes, and I had to figure out, not only how am I going to spotlight these two moments, but how will I make them distinct from each other? Yeah, I mean, those were by far the most labor-intensive pages, especially that final Times Square sequence of everyone celebrating the war finally coming to an end.
That is something, that's for sure. Now, let's talk a wee bit about the tools used to create this book. Can you walk me through your workflow?
So I worked entirely digitally for this project, which I do mainly for speed reasons. It's just far quicker to be able to go directly from pencils. Even some of my pencils, I can thumbnail the whole book, and then I can blow up those thumbnails and then use that as the basis for my pencils that I then tighten up. But, there's no scanning, there's no pausing in that process. I can sort of move through it pretty seamlessly. By working digitally, it means that it allows us to do edits, even in a page that would theoretically be completed, rather than having to redraw the whole thing, which, ideally there wouldn't be that. But I think especially for a historical project, there's going to be things you miss. I'm going over the material. Kate's going over the material. Our editors, we're going over the material. But we also have historical consultants. We have various people who are looking things over at every stage. And you get notes sometimes that are actually a dress wouldn't have quite looked like that. Or what would it like the cans of beans that we have depicted are not quite right. Whatever minor thing that you wouldn't even think about, we have to be prepared to adjust that. And by working digitally, it cuts down on the labor that would be involved in making a change like that so drastically. Those are all the pros for why I've really embraced working digitally with this. In terms of my actual process, I use a combination of Photoshop and Clip Studio. Clip Studio, I really like how the tools that they have for particularly panel borders and word balloons. I think that you can have some really nice looking word balloon tools using Clip Studio, and they make setting up panels and page layouts, and they make it so easy. I mean, this is why the program for Clip Studio was originally called Manga Studio. And then once I sort of set up my, panel borders and put in the word balloon, like essentially put in the template of everything, then I switched it over to Photoshop, and then I did my inks, colors, and text input in Photoshop. Partially because, for whatever reason, Photoshop has nicer text input tools than Clip Studio does, and it also works in. Oh God, yeah. I'm realizing as I say this, I'm getting very technical with this.
No, that's pretty cool. I like to hear.
Yeah. Well, so Clip Studio works in RGB. Only, and Photoshop works in CMYK, and I prefer to work in CMYK when I can because that's better for print.
Yeah, that's curious. I never heard that before. But do you think that's something that might be reconfigured in the future? There might be a new version down the road that would make it on par?
I'm surprised that Clip Studio does not offer CMYK, but I'm also, I'll let you know that I'm not the only artist who has expressed that. So I know they're aware. I think it might be a deeper problem than all that. This is beyond me in terms of from a technical level. I think I like both programs quite a bit, though. So that's why I've sort of developed a process that uses the best tools from both of them to make finished art.
Yeah, that's what you want. You want an easy workflow, and you don't want to be challenged. You don't want the tools to limit you in your output. So I see that you've got a great system set up. So that's good. Now, let's talk about illustrating examples. You've touched upon some challenges. Was there one specific one that was the toughest challenge in illustrating this book?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Was there a particular, each page sort of had its own challenge, like we've already spoken about from a research perspective, but you would have to learn to draw a new thing on every page. In particular, some of those shots of factories were quite difficult, only because, when you're depicting machinery, you have to be so precise about it. And you're depicting frames of cars, say, or frames of tanks or whatever other military vehicle was being constructed in some of the factories that we're showing in the books. And you're trying to get as accurate as you want while also needing to simplify a little bit for the cartooning style of the book. All of those were challenges. I will say that it's a challenge, but one that I kind of enjoy is walking the line. And this, I think, has been true of my previous work too. I really like the sort of back and forth between a more broad, fun, cartoony style and a more realistic, more serious style based on the tone of what it is that I need to depict. I mean, this book covers, there's some light stuff about, we go into the fact that sugar was rationed during the period. So kids, throughout the book, there's a running joke about kids wanting to have ice cream, and ice cream wasn't available due to sugar and dairy rationing at the time. And so we get to be sort of jokey and broad, and I try to draw it in a bit of a fun style as these kids are, tearing their hair out, being like, please, why is our sugar being rationed? But then you also have some of the serious moments from the period. I mean, we touch on some of the real horrors of the Second World War, the concentration camps. We have the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We talk about some of the Japanese internment camps that were going on in the US and Canada at the time, and you want to treat those subject matter with a degree of seriousness that the subject matter deserves. And so thinking of how I was going to depict those things and how to walk that tricky tonal line in terms of my visual representation, that was a challenge that I was thinking about regularly throughout the whole thing. But it's kind of a challenge that, for whatever reason, I enjoy engaging with. I enjoy massaging that and trying to think of how best to handle some of those tricky choices. I don't. Yeah, I feel like I'm rambling now. Did that answer
No,
the
no,
question?
that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not reviewing the book, but I think you've done a great job
Oh,
in
thank you.
presenting, that fine line, as you said. It's from a kid's point of view, but you don't shy away from the important aspects of the war and don't
Mm-hmm.
gloss over them. So that's important that people and readers understand that. Now,
Mm-hmm.
you touched on your previous book, The Good Fight, also set in historical times. I want to ask you, do you like illustrating history?
Yes, I do. I mean, I'm a little bit of a history. I enjoy listening to history podcasts and things like that. Have for a while, even before I started getting into doing these history books. I mean, I have other interests as well, and I'll even though I'm being vague about my next project, the next one won't necessarily be a historical book, but I do like. Well, especially as we move through over the last several years, we've been moving through these very, sweeping global events like the COVID-19 pandemic, like some of the, other sort of big international events, scary stuff that we've gone through. I think it's good to look back in the past and say, what are times that we have gone through similar moments, I guess, as a society, moments when it felt like what we had been taking for granted has to change because of something entirely out of our control. I really like being able to go back and tell stories that help people realize that these are with the nuance inside of it, and not with it not necessarily being exactly the same challenges, still saying, we as a society, we've gone through great challenges before, and here's what that was like, and here's what we could potentially learn from that, as a way to talk about that and sort of start those conversations. For those reasons, I've really enjoyed making these historical books.
Sure, sure. Now, this question is like completely out of left field, but I've been asking a lot of creators about artificial intelligence, AI. So I wanted to get your viewpoint. Do you think that AI is helpful or harmful to comic book creation?
It's a real hot button question right there. I mean, I don't love it, right? It does feel like I feel like it's a solution to a problem we didn't really have. It's an answer to a question that we weren't really asking. Art is something that, as humans, we tend to create as, individual creative expression. We do it to relate to each other. We do it to provoke emotions and provoke thought in one another. And to turn that over to a machine seems very strange to me. I mean, what are we hoping to achieve by doing that? It's a very sort of cold approach to art, I find, when you hope that you would hope that a lot of art would be in some ways individual expression. I do worry about I don't want to be unintentionally too much of a Luddite about it, I guess. I think that I'm someone who, like I said earlier, works entirely digitally, say. I want to be open to the idea of adapting to using new technology as part of an artistic process, and that I think that there is some value in that. And I'm sure that there is going to be some ways that the generative AI art that sort of has risen up is going to be useful as part of that. Maybe for doing concept work or something like that, there's going to be some value in that. Although even then, I think just the pure physical process of doing sketching, when you have an AI program doing that for you, I think that it's not just about a matter of conceiving it. Your hand has to learn it a bit in a funny way. You have to sort of get used to drawing those lines when it's all being done artificially. I worry some craft is getting lost. I don't know. I mean, I guess the decision is sort of out of our hands with some of it, unfortunately. But I do worry that the original intent of why we're making art is being lost in all this. I don't think that it's democratizing to have this. I think that it's diluting the whole purpose of what art can be by, embracing some of this stuff too readily.
Well said. I appreciate your feedback on that. So with all that being said, got a lot of projects on the go and stuff you can't talk about. So where do you recommend that people go online to find out about your current and your future projects?
So all my stuff can be found at just a simple URL, www.joshdraws.com. It's my portfolio website and links off to my various social medias and things like that. I actually need to update that because I've stopped being so active on Twitter/X. So I need to remove that link from my website, but I'm quite active still on Instagram. That's a good way to find updates from me. Either way, any new announcement stuff will be you'll be able to find through my website.
Great. Well, Josh, those really are all the questions I've got for you, but I'm wondering, is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
No, I mean, I hope that people enjoy the book. I hope that for everyone, it's a little bit of a snapshot of a different era, but an era that we can learn a lot from. I really appreciate the fact that the book, I hope that this comes across to readers, that we sort of showed what it was like going through the Second World War, but that it also, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. We show some of the parts of it that, even though it's for a kid audience, that were not always perfect too. Some of the inequalities that still persisted, some of the darker aspects of it, like we said, the Manhattan Project or Japanese internment camps, and being able to show this period as, the positives of us as a society coming together in sort of a greater, unfortunately necessary project at that point, but also some of the ways that it wasn't a perfect period too. And, hopefully that there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from that as well.
Thanks to Josh for the chat. You can discover more about Josh online at joshdraws.com and on Instagram at jrosen.illustration. Thanks for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel and hit the notification button. You can follow along at True North Country Comics on most social media sites. And if you have any feedback whatsoever, please send it to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. If you want to help the site and the podcast, please consider supporting the effort by chipping in at ko-fi.com/True North Country Comics. Your patronage is greatly appreciated. Thanks for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2023.